Timeline of Russian innovation encompasses key events in the history of technology in Russia, starting from the early East Slavs and up to the Russian Federation. The entries in this timeline fall into the following categories: indigenous inventions, like airliners, AC transformers, radio receivers, TV, artificial satellites, ICBMs, products and objects that are uniquely Russian, like St. Basil's Cathedral, Matryoshka dolls, Russian vodka, products and objects with superlative characteristics, like the Tsar Bomba, the AK-47, and Typhoon class submarine. Scientific and medical discoveries, like the periodic law, vitamins, stem cells, and viruses. This timeline examines scientific and medical discoveries, products and technologies introduced by various peoples of Russia and its predecessor state, regardless of ethnicity, and also lists inventions by naturalized immigrant citizens. Certain innovations achieved by a national operation may be included in this timeline, in cases where the Russian side played a major role in such projects. Early East Slavicis baked milk. Ruzhenka baked milk is made by simmering milk on low heat for 8 hours or longer. The product has a light brown color, a specific taste, and the ability to be stored safely at room temperature for up to 40 hours, much longer than most milk-based beverages. It has been produced since ancient times, typically using a Russian oven. Nowadays it is produced on an industrial scale. Sourdough fermented baked milk, traditionally known as Ruzhenka, is especially popular in Russia. Banya. A banya is a traditional Russian wet steam bath, where bathing takes place inside special rooms or stand-alone wooden houses, with steam being produced by splashing water upon a heated furnace. Historically, banya developed simultaneously with its closest relative, the Finnish sauna. However, modern saunas converted to dry steam, while banyas continue to use wet steam. Banya temperatures may exceed 110 degrees Celsius, and people often hit themselves or others with bunches of dried branches and leaves from white birch, oak or eucalyptus in order to improve the circulation. It is customary to cool off outdoors or splash around in cold water, or even in a lake or river. In the winter, people may roll in the snow or jump into the water through holes in the ice. After 2 or 3 sessions of sweating and cooling off, the ritual ends with drinking beverages or tea, playing games or relaxing in good company in an antechamber off the steam room. Blini are thin pancakes made with yeast. Blin comes from Old Slavic mlin, that means to mill. Russian blini are made with yeasted batter, which is left to rise. It is then diluted with cold or boiling water or milk. Blini may have originated in the time of the Slavic unity, and they had a somewhat ritual significance for the early Slavs in pre-Christian times, since they were a symbol of the sun due to the round form. Blini were traditionally prepared at the end of the winter to honor the rebirth of the new sun. This tradition was adopted by the Orthodox Church and is carried on to the present day. Many people follow a simpler method of mixing flour, milk, sugar, egg, oil, and vanilla, with no yeast. They are eaten folded or rolled with a meat mixture or with jam, honey, or any sweet condiment. Gusli is the oldest type of Slavic and Russian multi-string plucked instrument. Preserved instruments discovered by archaeologists have between 5 and 9 strings, in one case even 12. Gusli may have derived from a Byzantine form of the Greek cathedra and have a number of relative instruments, like the Finnish cantel. The first mention of gusli dates back to 591 AD, to a treatise by the Greek historian Theophylactes Amokata, which describes the instrument being used by Slavs from the area of the later Kievan Rus. The gusli are thought to have been the instrument used by the legendary Boyan and other heroes of Russian mythology. In later times, gusli were widely used by wandering musicians and entertainers. Skomarok. Izba. An izba is a traditional Russian countryside dwelling, a type of log house suited to the colder climate of northeastern Europe and Siberia. Traditional old-style izba construction involved the use of simple tools, such as ropes, axes, knives, and spades. Nails were not generally used, as metal was relatively expensive, and neither were saws. Both the interior and exterior were made of split tree trunks. The gap between was usually filled with clay from a riverbed. For the 15th century on, the central element of the interior of an izba was the Russian oven. Outside izbas were often embellished by various special architectural features, for example rich wood carving decorations on windows. Such decorative elements and the use of the Russian oven are still commonly found in many modern Russian countryside houses. Kosovo-Rodka. A Kosovo-Rodka is a Russian skewed collared shirt, long-sleeved and reaching down to mid-thigh, a traditional top garment going back to ancient times. The name derived from Koso and Vorot, since the collar of this shirt appears skewed when it is left unbuttoned. The collar and sleeves of Kosovo-Rodka were often decorated with a traditional Slavic ornamentation. It was worn by peasants and townsmen of various social categories until the early 20th century, until it was replaced by less elaborate clothing. The garment is also known as a Tolstuka, or the Tolstoy shirt, because the writer Count Leo Tolstoy customarily wore one in the later years of his life. Now Kosovo-Rodkas appear mostly as souvenirs and as decorative garments in Russian folk art ensembles. Lapti is an East Slavic version of bast shoes, a kind of basket fit to the shape of a foot. Lapti were woven primarily from bast of the linden tree or from birchbark. They were easy to manufacture, but not very durable. In Russia, lapti were worn until the 1920s or 1930s as a cheap replacement for leather shoes, just like clogs in the Western Europe. Shishi is a Russian soup with cabbage as the primary ingredient, which makes it possible for the prepared dish to be stored safely for a rather long time without it losing its taste qualities. Generally it is made with either fresh cabbage or sauerkraut and other winter vegetables, although meat may be added. Shi made with sauerkraut has a sour taste and is called sour shi. A summer sorrel soup, also popular in pre-revolutionary and modern Russia, is known as green shi. Usually smetana cream is added into shi before serving. Smetana is a thick, yellowish white and slightly sour-tasting cream which contains about 40% milk fat. It is made by curdling pasteurized cream. In Russian cooking, it is used in virtually everything from appetizers and main courses to desserts. It is somewhat close to a crème fraîche, but is much heavier and thicker, with usually 36% to 42% milk fat or even higher, and is more sour in taste. Smetana is ideal to be used in dishes requiring a long cooking time in the oven, since it will not curdle when cooked or added to hot dishes. Kievan Rus. 10th century. Architecture of Kievan Rus. The earliest Kievan churches were built and decorated with frescoes and mosaics by Byzantine masters. The great churches of Kievan Rus, built after the adoption of Christianity in 988, were the first examples of monumental architecture in the East Slavic lands. Early Eastern Orthodox churches were mainly made of wood, while major cathedrals often featured scores of small domes. The 10th century Church of the Tithes in Kiev was the first to be made of stone. Kokoshnik. The kokoshnik is a traditional Russian headdress for women. It is patterned to match the style of the sarafan and can be pointed around. It is tied at the back of the head with long thick ribbons in a large bow. The forehead is sometimes decorated with pearls or other jewelry. The word kokoshnik appeared in the 16th century. However, the earliest headdress pieces of a similar type were found in the 10th to 12th century burials in Veliky Novgorod. It was worn by girls and women on special occasions until the Russian Revolution, and was subsequently introduced into Western fashion by Russian émigrés. 989 kvas's okroshka kvas's. A kvas, sometimes called in English a bread drink, is a fermented beverage made from black rye bread, which contributes to its light or dark color by the content of alcohol resulted from fermentation. It is classified as non-alcoholic, up to 1.2% of alcohol, which is so low that it is considered acceptable for consumption by children. While the early low-alcoholic prototypes of kvas were known in some ancient civilizations, its modern, almost non-alcoholic form originated in Eastern Europe. Kvas's was first mentioned in the Russian Primary Chronicle, which tells how Prince Vladimir the Great gave kvas among other beverages to the people, while celebrating the Christianization of Kievan Rus. Kvas is also known as the main ingredient in okroshka, a Russian cold soup. 989 Multi-domed church. The multi-domed church is a typical form of Russian church architecture, which distinguishes Russia from other Orthodox nations and Christian denominations. Indeed, the earliest Russian churches built just after the Christianization of Kievan Rus were multi-domed, which led some historians to speculate what Russian pre-Christian pagan temples might have looked like. Namely, these early churches were 13-domed wooden St. Sophia Cathedral in Novgorod and 25-domed stone Desyatinaya Church in Kiev. The number of domes typically has a symbolical meaning in Russian architecture. For example, 13 domes symbolize Christ with 12 apostles, while 25 domes mean the same with additional 12 prophets from the Old Testament. Multiple domes of Russian churches were often made of wooden work comparatively smaller than the Byzantine domes. 997 Kissel. A kissel is a dessert that consists of sweetened juice, typically that of berries, thickened with oats, cornstarch or potato starch, with red wine or dried fruits added sometimes. The dessert can be served either hot or cold, and if made using less thickening starch it can be consumed as a beverage, which is common in Russia. Kissel was mentioned for the first time in the Primary Chronicle, where it forms part of the story of how a besieged Russian city was saved from nomadic Pechenegs. 11th century Birchbark document. A Birchbark document is a document written on pieces of birch bark. This form of writing material was developed independently by several ancient cultures. In Rus, the usage of the specially prepared birch bark as a cheap replacement for pergament paper became widespread soon after the Christianization of the country. The earliest Russian birchbark documents have been found in Veliky Novgorod. In total, more than 1,000 such documents have been discovered, most of them in Novgorod and the rest in other ancient cities in Russia, Ukraine and Belarus. Many birchbark documents were written by common people rather than by clergy and nobility. This fact led some historians to suggest that before the Mongol invasion of Rus, the level of literacy in the country might have been considerably higher than in contemporary Western Europe. Koch icebreaker. The koch was an ancient form of icebreaker, being a special type of one or two small wooden sailing ships with a mast, used for voyages in the icy conditions of the Arctic seas and Siberian rivers. The koch was developed by the Russian Pomors in the 11th century, when they started settling on the White Sea shores. The koch's hull was protected by a belt of ice-flow-resistant flush skin planking along the variable water waterline, and had a false keel for on-ice portage. If a koch was in danger of being trapped in the ice fields, its rounded body lines below the surface would allow for the ship to be pushed up out of the water and onto the ice with no damage. In the 19th century, similar protective features were adopted to modern icebreakers. Gurdok. The gurdok is an ancient East Slavic string musical instrument, played with a bow. It usually had 3 strings, 2 of them tuned in unison and played as a drone, the third tuned a fifth higher. All 3 strings were in the same plane at the bridge, so that a bow could make them all sound at the same time. Sometimes the gurdok also had several sympathetic strings under the sounding board. These made the gurdok sound warm and rich. It was also possible to play while standing or dancing, which made it popular amongst Komaroks. The name gurdok comes from the 17th century, however the same type of instrument existed from 11th to 16th century, but was called smyk. Medovica is an Old Slavic honey-based alcoholic beverage very similar to mead, but much cheaper and faster to make. Since the old times, the Slavs exported the fermented mead as a luxury product to Europe in huge quantities. Fermentation occurs naturally over 15 to 50 years, originally rendering the product very expensive and only accessible to the nobility. However, in the 11th century, East Slavs found that fermentation occurred much faster when the honey mixture was heated, enabling Medovic to become a commonly available drink in the territory of Rus. In the 14th century, the invention of distillation made it possible to create a prototype of the modern Medovica. However, vodka was invented at the same time and gradually surpassed Medovica in popularity. 1048 Russian fist fighting. Russian fist fighting is an ancient Russian combat sport, basically similar to modern boxing. However, it features some indigenous techniques and often fought in collective events called stenka na stenku. It has existed since the times of Kievan Rus, first mentioned in the primary chronicle in the year 1048. The government and the Russian Orthodox Church often tried to prohibit the fights. However, fist fighting remained popular until the 19th century, while in the 20th century some of the old techniques were adopted for the modern Russian martial arts. 12th century Panache. The panache is a type of flanged mace developed since the 12th century in the region of Kievan Rus and later widely used throughout Europe. The name comes from the Russian word meaning feather, reflecting the form of panache that resembled an arrow with fletching. The most popular variety of panache had 6 flanges and was called chestopia. Panache was the first form of the flanged mace to find wide usage. It was perfectly suited to defeat plate armor and platelin mail. In later times it was often used as a symbol of power by military leaders in Eastern Europe. Shashka. The shashka is a special kind of saber, a very sharp, single-edged, single-handed, and guardless sword. In appearance, the shashka is midway between a full saber and a straight sword. It has a slightly curved blade, and could be effective for both slashing and thrusting. Originally, the shashka was developed in the 12th century by Circassians in the northern Caucasus. These lands were integrated into the Russian Empire in the 18th century. By that time, shashka was adopted as the main cold weapon by Russian Cossacks. Treshotka. The treshotka, sometimes referred in plural as treshotki, is a Russian folk music idiophone instrument which is used to imitate hand clapping. Basically, it is a set of small boards on a string that get clapped together as a group. There are no known documents confirming the usage of the treshotka in ancient Russia. However, the remnants of what might have been the earliest 12th century treshotka were recently found in Novgorod. 1149 Bear spear. The bear spear, a rogatina, was a medieval type of spear used in bear hunting and also to hunt other large animals, like wisents and war horses. The sharpened head of a bear spear was enlarged and usually had the form of a bay leaf. Right under the head there was a short crosspiece that helped to fix the spear in the body of an animal. Often it was placed against the ground on its rear point, which made it easier to absorb the impact of the attacking beast. The Russian chronicles first mention rogatina as a military weapon in the year 1149, and as a hunting weapon in the year 1255. 13th century. Sokka. The sokka is a light wooden plough which could be pulled by one horse. Its origin was in northern Russia, most likely in the Novgorod Republic, where it was used as early as in the 13th century. A characteristic feature of sokka construction is the bifurcated ploughing tip, so that a sokka has two ploughshares, later made of metal, which cut the soil. The sokka is an evolution of a scratch plough by an addition of a spade-like detail which turns the cut soil over. Pelmeni. Pelmeni is a dish originating from Siberia, now considered part of Russian national cuisine. It is a type of dumpling consisting of a filling that is wrapped in thin unleavened dough. The word pelmeni comes from the Finno-Ugric Komi, Udmurt, and Mansi languages. It is unclear when pelmeni entered the cuisines of indigenous Siberian people and when it first appeared in Russian cuisine, but most likely it was during the Mongol conquests and Mongol-Tatar invasion of Rus in the 13th century, when Mongol Tatars took the basic idea from the Chinese dumplings and brought it to Siberia and Eastern Europe. Onion dome. The onion dome is a dome whose shape resembles an onion, after which they are named. Such domes are often larger in diameter than the drum upon which they are set, and the height usually exceeds the width. The whole bulbous structure tapers smoothly to a point. The so-called onion dome is the dominant form for church domes in Russia, and though the earliest preserved Russian domes of the type date from the 16th century, illustrations of the old chronicles indicate that they were used since the late 13th century.